looking at the presentations that there have been so far today, in terms of, I'll come back to me as a buccaneer, looking at the presentations there have been, there are lots of amazing stories. There's Revenge of the Nerds. There's possibly a reference to Jurassic Park, big data versus little data, or big data versus smart data. I think we even had Bend It Like Bonamy as the presentation before one. I also saw on Twitter there was the mysterious case of the extremely long title for presentations at market research conferences. I have two confessions to make to you. I'll make one now, and then I'll make one during the course of these 30 minutes or so. And that is that I'm not a market researcher nor a data analyst. As you can tell, I'm a storyteller. I live in Lewes, East Sussex, and this is what we do on Bonfire Night. We dress up as buccaneers and do interesting things. I want to just tell you a little bit about how I got to be a data-driven storyteller. I grew up as a classicist. I studied classical civilization and literature, university first time round. Went into marketing, into communications, was always one of the strategic ones, i.e. the ones who was given the data to make sense of, one of the planners. And then went back to school and did a master's and then a doctorate in experimental psychology, where I was looking for the reasons why people were binge drinking and behaving in particular ways. And then came back into consulting, and 4 years ago created a data-driven storytelling agency, consultancy, called Insight Agents. And what we do is to look for the really powerful and persuasive stories that companies, organizations, governments, third sector organizations can tell using data as the foundation. So everybody in this room playing with data, using data, looking for insights with data. We are all, in the words of the American business writer Dan Pink, in his book, To Sell is Human, we are all in the moving business. We are all in the business of persuading people to do things. Now, for me, that is done best when there's analytics at the heart of it, but also when we can wrap it in the veneer of emotion to tell powerful and persuasive stories. Narrative by numbers, I appreciate, particularly before a coffee break, there's nothing more boring than someone about to publish a book. I'm about to publish a book called Narrative by Numbers, How to Tell Powerful and Purposeful Stories. It brings together the rules and principles that I think are incredibly valuable to people in all sorts of businesses, but very relevant to everybody here. It brings together those rules and principles, which for many of you will be absolutely second nature. I don't imagine there won't be a few of you who don't think, no shit, Sherlock, to a few of the points I make, to a few of the golden rules. But I wanted to bring them together and to share them with you in this session. So narrative by numbers. Why do I want to talk about narrative by numbers? Okay, it's a nice alliterative meme that might stick in your head, but narrative by numbers. I think we've probably heard quite a lot today about the fact that we are all surrounded by a huge amount of data. It's no shock that there's a lot of data. It provides a great deal of hassle and harassment and difficulty, but handled right and used in the correct way, it can unlock those insights that lead to those brilliant ideas. We've heard from Sport England and about the FA campaign. I'll reference the This Girl Can campaign later on, and how that used really interesting, really intelligent data analytics and research to drive the powerful insight that unlocked such a successful campaign. But narrative by numbers, because we are all surrounded by data. When my car, 2-year-old car, broke down the other day, AA man came along. I know nothing about cars, apart from how to drive them reasonably well. I said, I'm not sure it's not starting, I don't know, I was a bit flustered, I was late for a meeting. The calm of the AA man plugged his SCART lead into the car, underneath the steering wheel. I had no idea there was... And he said, oh, yes, it's this, this, and this, put it right, and away he went. So the data that surrounds automotive companies, the data in telcos, the data in every single business. So there's a lot of it about, and those that use it effectively, those that use it as the foundation stones for their narrative, I believe will be the ones that have competitive advantage. Now, there are two problems I want to talk to you about. One is the problem with education, not the problem with Educating Greater Manchester, a fabulous programme. The problem with education being that for too long, in this culture And in many other English-speaking cultures, and indeed around the world, STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, where analytics will fall, have been kept apart from arts subjects. Now, there's a move to bring them together as STEAM, but I remember at school first time round when Latin and Greek came much easier, more easily than mathematics, I was badly taught at maths. And indeed, going to university in the mid-late 80s first time round, it was kind of cool for the artist to say, I really don't understand maths. And there's still a little bit of that, I really don't understand maths. But the problem, I think, with education was first put by C.P. Snow, who was an amazing Renaissance man in as much as he was both a scientist and a writer of culture. And I just want to read you something he said at a lecture in Cambridge in 1959. A good many times, he said, I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of traditional culture, are thought to be highly educated, and who have, with considerable gusto, been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. So clearly they were the artists. Once or twice, I've been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold, it was also negative. And yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? He goes on, I now believe that if I'd asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration? Which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read? Not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world, running the Western world, have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. So he makes a strong point. He goes on to say that the forced separation of humanities and sciences will prevent the world from solving its most pressing challenges. Now, we are all collectively on a mission to bring these together, and I want to, my purpose here is to be the champion of bringing narrative and numbers together. There's a second problem. I've retrained as a psychologist, having been a classicist. There's a big problem, I think, with psychology that separates the brain into two discrete, separate hemispheres. And the data geeks, well, they kind of live over here, and the artists, they live over there. So that is such a gross oversimplification of how the mind works. Steve Pinker, the Harvard psychologist, in his modestly titled book, How the Mind Works, says that we don't have the cognitive architecture to understand how the mind works. There are 100+ neurotransmitters that all interact with one another. And as data scientists and as SPSS survivors in this room, you will know that a 3, 4, 5 level interaction is hard enough to understand. 120 level interaction, almost impossible. So this has been perpetrated. It's become a popular media meme, and it's not helping because the problem of education putting people into artists and scientists, the problem of psychologists saying you're a left brainer or a right brainer. Yeah, sure, I can see there's a bit of that, but actually we've all got the capacity to do both. Now, the two skills that I believe we all need, again using this Dan Pink, we are all in the moving business. Whether we're a teacher who wants her children to do homework, we're in the moving and persuading business. Whether we're a doctor who wants his elderly patient to carry on with a regimen of drugs. Whether we're marketeers wanting to sell really sugary yogurt to teenagers. Whatever we are, we need to be able to look at and make sense of data and then use that as the foundation for our storytelling. And there are two reasons why this matters. We've heard about big data, and I love the use of smart data. As a footnote, I regularly contribute to a podcast called the Small Data Forum. We think there's no point in obsessing about the bigness of big data because it gets bigger and bigger all the time. What we need, as we've heard it eloquently in the presentations today, is to look for that little corner of big data that is manageable. It might be a big data set, but is manageable, and we can make sense out of it. But it matters because there's so much data, but it matters because many more voices matter. This is not the world of rigid, line-managed corporate communication. How many of you here today representing a business are tweeting on behalf of your business. You're giving a part of your soul in order to advance your career, in order to make people think, actually, he's not wasting or she's not wasting all her time at this conference. They're really obviously getting some good stuff. But many more voices matter. The images that people build up of organizations are in part built through social platforms. So that's why it matters. And I would argue that there is a universal and a fundamental equation in modern communications which we can power, which is that analytics plus storytelling equals influence. I'm a reductionist, but I hope that isn't too simple for you. Okay, so between now and coffee and possibly cake left over from lunchtime, there are 7 golden rules that I want to go through. As I say, there's nothing incredibly original about these golden rules, but I think if you put these together and if you use these as the lens, as the glasses through which you look at the data sets that you manage, then you're more likely to be able to help your companies, your clients, to be able to tell powerful, purposeful stories with data. The first one is about relevance. And so this smart data comment from Jane earlier on, finding and using only relevant data, not trying to boil the ocean, not trying to use absolutely everything that there is. Now, confession number 2. I said I wasn't a market researcher or an analyst, or a data analyst, although I have skills in both. Confession number 2 is that in the mid-1980s, I had a mullet. I mention this because a good friend of mine who's written a number of books about social media analytics describes the word cloud as the mullet of social media analytics. It kind of seemed like a good idea at the time, but then you begin to look at it. I've just put some words of different shapes and sizes up here. So I thought it was really compelling in the FA presentation from the 2 Pauls to think about the different coloured balls, different types of data that the FA had and that was publicly available data. So what kind of information do companies have? They've covered that really well. You have attitudinal data, you have social media analytics, obviously, you have news data analytics, you have polling. You have market data and weather data. God, I remember that winter or that year of 2012, because I have a son who's now 14 and his games of football were cancelled for about 5 months in the course of that year. They had a long midwinter break. But weather data, I've worked with the sheds, as they call themselves, with Wix and with B&Q. And weather data, and particularly weather on bank holiday, is absolutely the predictive factor on how they're going to do this quarter, this year. So weather data, drug data, employee data, academic data, analyst data, so much data. So how do you find what is the right data to use? Obviously, you can use models and algorithms, as we were hearing from Paul and Paul. But what is right for you? And I think you must think I mentioned Dan Pink. I'm now going to mention Simon Sinek. I've mentioned Steve Pinker. So there we are. There's 3 American or North American men. You must think that when you see Start With Why, I'm obsessed with people that come from North America. Not particularly, but I think that starting with why, looking for purpose, is just as important in your data analytics, is just as important in setting up the hypothesis that you're going to test by your analysis of data as it is for finding the purpose of the corporation. Asking the right questions and then identifying these corners of little big data, can we call it. So don't be intimidated. It's very intimidated. I don't see much sense of intimidation from those presentations we've seen today. But don't be intimidated and help your clients, if they are intimidated, not to be. So here's a story. I have this tallest poppy because it's about Tesco. This is Tesco in 2010, long before Phil Clark, long before Drastic Dave, when it was still on a Terry Leahy rise up. When I got back from summer holiday in 2010, there was an interesting email from the head of planning at Red Brick Road, their then agency, saying, "Oh, have you seen what Waitrose have done? They've launched Essentials. They're parking their tanks on our lawn. We're going to do quality, and we've done a few quality ads, and they're not really cutting through. We're more than about finest. We've got great, really good quality products. How can we do this?" And I said, well, we'll have a conversation. They said, go up to Cheshunt. So we went up to Cheshunt when they still had an office in Cheshunt. And we met the food marketing director, and she said, I don't know how we're going to do this because advertising isn't cutting through, and no one believes us, and no one likes us. We're the Millwall of retailers. And she was a bit kind of desperate. And she said, I don't know, we even did this competition. We did this competition with 30,000 of our customers, always our customers. They completed this competition with postcards. It was pre-email competitions. It was postcards. And the competition was, my favorite quality Tesco product is, and there was the 30-word ... And she said, and here's the data, have a spreadsheet. So I thought, great, have a spreadsheet. Took it home and worked all night. It was a summer's day, but kind of worked all night. As the dawn was rising, I kind of thought, I think I might have something, because I did a linguistic analysis of the words that people were using. Fortunately, some little intern had typed in every single entry. And things began to cluster together. And there was stuff about expertise and authority, and there was Britishness and freshness and closeness to farm gate, and their hero products, the improvements that they'd done. Those were kind of Tesco's-y corporate things, but there was stuff around here. And I went for a walk, and I went to the Tate Museum. I strongly advise, if you ever want to have an insight, don't do it in your office. Go for a walk, go for a run, go for a swim, but don't do it in your office. And then it became clear that the way to tell stories about the quality of Tesco products was to talk about the farmers that they worked with, the producers who were the heroes of this company, who had grown, in many cases, into hundreds of millions or billions of pounds worth of businesses, but had grown alongside Tesco and whose quality was absolutely central. Now, this would do a number of things, but it would particularly allow Tesco to address the myth that they screwed all of their suppliers to the floor, because they would be telling stories. But they would be telling really credible third-party stories about, this is the sprout grower, as you can tell. I grow half of Tesco's sprouts, but he wouldn't mention Tesco's, and the article and the social media content wouldn't mention Tesco until paragraph 2 or 3. So you'd be telling a story based on the linguistic analysis of a spreadsheet. So I'm just saying, look at the right part of data, analyze it in a smart way, and you can come up with incredibly powerful insights. Now, do you know the work of Tyler Vegan? If you don't know the work of Tyler Vegan, go to Amazon even now and buy his book, Spurious Correlations. So avoiding false positives and spurious correlations. The number of this guy, Tyler Vegan, I don't even think he's finished his Harvard Law degree, because he's got so obsessed. TylerVegan.com and SpuriousCorrelations.com. There are 30,000 publicly available data sets he's got from all over, and he's just gone on a classic fishing expedition. Heard the dangers maybe from the FA of going on a classic fishing expedition. Number of films people have drowned by falling into a pool, and the films that Nicolas Cage have appeared in. Pretty good correlation. Where's the coefficient? Much better one is the divorce rate in Maine and per capita consumption of margarine. It's a good book. And even if Tyler doesn't ever become a lawyer, he should be able to retire on the strength of his book. Very good website, well worth it. So lots of data mean lots of possible correlations, don't they? So let's go on. Let's seek out and be detectives and go on detective stories and not go on fishing expeditions. Know where to start. Start with why. Use that Sinek principle, and also consider hidden third causes. I mean, there was, we know this, don't we? Of course, we know this. But do the media know this? Almost never, and do clients sometimes not? There was a great story about hormone replacement therapy and cardiovascular disease, and there appeared to be a connection between HRT and reduction in CVD in peri- and postmenopausal women. And that was based on epidemiological data, and then they looked into the data, and whilst they were looking into the data, lots of doctors were prescribing, saying this is not only good for confidence and for mood and for body status and so on, but it's good for coronary heart disease as well. What, of course, happened when they looked into the data was find that those women who had reduced coronary heart disease took more exercise, had better diets. There were confounding third factors. I want to give you one other story about an ice cream sandwich company. New ice cream sandwich company a couple of years ago. True story. Senior marketing director, and she hired a new marketing manager for this brand, who then immediately in February hired a social media agency. And they started putting together a plan and putting out work, and the tweets went up, and as the year went on through March and April and May, the profile of the company started to go up. So brand manager was really excited, and then the sales of the ice cream sandwich started to go up, and it was really exciting. And he bounced into his marketing director's office and said, look, this social media agency are doing such a good job. I want to give them more budget. You know, we've only got a couple of months of the summer left. I want to give them more budget to really capitalize on that. And she very respectfully kind of pushed her chair back and got out from behind her desk and drew a graph and said, so we've got tweets going up, positive tweets about us going up, distribution going up because it's, and time. So it's the summer. That's when people talk about ice cream sandwiches, and our brand. So no, you can't have any more money for them, but make sure they do an even better job. But hidden third causes. It's basic, I know it's elementary, but how often, if we go on a fishing expedition, when there is so much data, particularly publicly available data out there, how often could we fall into the trap of finding a Tyler Vegan type spurious correlation? I'll just let you read this from The Onion. Of course it does. Anybody with children who play video games will know that when video games are exposed to violent children, then the characters are more aggressive. Of course it does. The signal and the noise. So I'm not suggesting that you all become, but detecting the signal from the noise, being able to do that, having the critical faculty to do it yourselves, and then when advising clients or when looking at your own data. I'm not suggesting that you become as brilliant as Nate Silver. That would be, the world would be too small if we all became Nate Silver. But distilling, discarding, discovering, inspecting again, asking why before you analyze, learning from history like our ice cream salesman marketing director, and beware dashboard syndrome. So dashboards, great, absolutely fantastic, nothing against dashboards, but how do you make them meaningfully sticky? If you can get them, if you can get the dashboards that are pulling all of your data together, the dashboards that you're creating bespoke, the dashboards that you're white labeling, the dashboards that you're buying in, if you can get them to genuinely deliver the data-driven insights that can give you purposeful and powerful stories, allowing you to differentiate yourself, fantastic. But beware dashboard syndrome, because it can look bright and shiny, and then 3 months later, it's not anymore. I was going to show some ads, but tea's coming, so I won't show ads. 20 years have flown. Remember the Easyjet ad after 20 years with the couple on the big wheel going around, and they had a young daughter who became an older daughter, and then she got a boyfriend. An amazing piece of integrated communication from Easyjet, an amazing award-winning piece of integrated communication. They did some really interesting aggregating of all of their data over 20 years. As a side, I've done a lot of work with Addison Lee, the world's biggest minicab company, in their existential fight against the Californian newcomers. Since 1975, they've invested very heavily in tech. I think in 1975 it was 2 tin cans and a piece of string, but they've invested very heavily in tech. So if you go into their HQ, they've got 4 of the biggest screens you've seen, and every single one of their 4,500 cars in red or green, whether they're driving on, they collect data, and they know what London does. They know how London behaves. They know that if you work on the Isle of Dogs until 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, you're likely to go to the Chiltern Firehouse. And they use that then to tailor marketing to corporate and to individual customers. Easyjet put together the most fantastic aggregated story about how things had changed. Carolyn McCall was still in charge at this time, how things had changed since Stelios was the young pretender to Easyjet becoming the biggest single flyer out of Gatwick, off many business people's first choice. Unless you're going to Milan, don't take Easyjet to Milan, because it takes you to Southend, the equivalent of Southend. Anyway, but how amazingly this company had changed. But also, what they then did was to write to 12.5 million of their customers around Europe with individual, tailored emails that said, do you remember when we first flew together? We went to Dubrovnik. And it's funny, isn't it, how... And then there was that great family party, because they could tell there were 10 people with the same surname, that great family party to Athens. And why do you always sit in seat 7A? Is there something superstitious? So they told real personal and close stories about how 20 years had flown together. And interestingly, I know that maybe in the stereotype, millennials would really welcome and expect and say fantastic to this kind of hyper kind of targeted marketing, but maybe older generations might say, I don't want you to be stalking me like this. Actually, across the board, 12.5 emails to customers, 100% more opens, 14 times the booking of a standard email because they'd taken so much care to say, we've had a great time together, we hope we can rely on your custom in the future, and here's a special offer. And that here's a special offer, 14 times the number of bookings. I think that's an amazing piece of data-driven storytelling on a macro level and also on a micro individual customer level. So that's signal from noise. The curse of knowledge. Steve Pinker, this Harvard psychologist, as well as his modest How the Mind Works book, written a book called The Sense of Style. He writes beautifully, and he also writes a lot about how to write beautifully. The curse of knowledge is simply this. If you know a lot about something, particularly if you're an academic or somebody who's studied something and has a lot of data about something, if you know a lot about something, it's really hard to imagine that you don't know that. So when you're feeding back to your client or explaining to the board, it's very hard to avoid using both jargon and lots of statistics and lots of data. If you're very familiar with all the crosstabs, you run all of the analyses, but those you're presenting to haven't. And I think the curse of knowledge is a fundamental failing of empathy. And I think a lot of data-driven storytelling that doesn't work well is because people have a fundamental failing of empathy. They're not able to put themselves, or they don't take the time to put themselves into the shoes, into the mind of the people that they're presenting to. So the curse of knowledge, beware of the curse of knowledge. My business did an analysis. We were interested in clarity. We're storytellers, data-driven storytellers. We did an analysis last month of the top 50 FTSE 100 top 50 companies by market capitalization. And we harvested the About Us pages, and we harvested the text of the CEO's annual review, and we ran them through an analyzer for linguistic complexity. And we found which companies spoke clearly and simply, and which companies spoke complete gobbledygook. And the rank by clarity is the final column is very different from the rank in terms of market capitalization. Now, what I'm not saying, correlation doesn't equal causation, is that there is currently in one snapshot that there is currently a relationship between how clearly you speak as a company, how easy you are to understand, and how big you are as a company. But what I am saying is that in the always-on, on-demand, on-my-terms world, customers, and that includes business analysts and city analysts, are going to switch off if you speak in a way that is too complex, that you are falling foul to this curse of knowledge. So beware the curse of knowledge. Temper the rational with the emotional. So I think it's, since Ogilvy on, since Byrne back on, we know that this is that storytelling that tempers rational and emotional works well. But think about using statistics as the starting point and then wrap them in a veneer of emotion. Now, I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about 350 million a week. You can throw things at me if you will, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it. The week after the EU referendum, New Scientist editorial concluded that for reason to triumph, for those in the market research and data analytics business to succeed, scientists need to learn to engage with emotion. Now, I would argue that this piece of data-driven storytelling is very clever and extremely deceitful. It's very clever because it's got a number, and I'll just talk a little bit about that number, and the three most emotive letters in the British English language, N, H, and S. That is an amazing piece of rational and emotional. So, is it a good statistic? Is it a bad statistic? Is it a zombie statistic? I think it's all of those things. So it's simple, it's round, it's rounded up, it ends with a 0. But it's not suspiciously rounded like 400 million or 500 million. That would have been incredible. It's big, but it's not too big. So, if you'd have said 18 billion, which is 350 times 52, that would have been too big. But this could be that Mexico lottery win that happened the week before. 300, it's a lot of money, so it must be a lot of money. And it's weekly. So, as I say, it's not too big. It's weekly. We could see that. It's a compound variable. It takes in lots of different things. What it doesn't take in, of course, is rebates. But it takes in lots of different things, and it deliberately avoids context, which is why I think that it's the good things about that as a piece of data-driven storytelling are completely undermined. But it's repeated ad nauseam. It's not Project Fears, this statistic, that statistic, this statistic. It's repeated ad nauseam, not only by the Leave camp, but also by the Remain camp, because they were having to go on to criticize it and to say that 350 million a week, it's a nonsense statistic. But it became an earworm, it became a defining statistic. And then 2 hours after the referendum was called, Nigel Farage was asked about it, and he said, well, I don't know, maybe, on Good Morning TV. Now, this is just the context here. It's less than a rounding error. It says 1%. Actually, this is 2015 figures. 735 billion government expenditure, 3.7 billion after rebates. It's less than a rounding error. We'd ignore that amount of money. And then eventually it came out, but it was too late. But it fails, it refuses to die. Boris keeps on using it. He used it to undermine Theresa May in Florence last year. He's used it again 2 weeks ago. Beautifully, our great Sir David Norgrove wrote a fantastic letter who was surprised and disappointed that Boris continued to use this statistic. But it has become really the zombie statistic of the EU referendum. Briefly, keep your workings out in reserve. So it's really important that you've got all of this fantastic data. And slides 1 to 162 are great, but don't let the client see they're 162 when you fire up the PowerPoint. But if they're interested enough, if you've got the compelling killer stats at the beginning and they're interested enough and they want to hear, they'll ask you for more. But keep your working out in reserve. Spotify, great campaign. Dear person, you must think I'm obsessed with this campaign. Dear 3,749 people who streamed It's the End of the World as We Know It on the day of the Brexit vote, hang in there. This is a campaign that ran in 10 countries. It wasn't about Brexit, it was about Valentine's Day. It was about, but Spotify knows who's playing what, how often and where, and they've used it as the foundation stone of some really powerful, I would say, narrative by numbers. Finally, talk human. I think this is really a statement of the obvious. I think that, I won't show this obviously, not in the interest of time, but what an amazing campaign, second campaign, sustained increase in women's participation in sport, not just football, of I think more than 1.5 million over several years. And the foundation stone of this was some really, really interesting research. 85% of women who don't do sports say it's because they're afraid of being judged. Actually, the judgment that is being meted out on them is, I should do that. Gosh, I really respect you. And using that and using real women in the campaign, really exercising, I think really dramatizes this piece of data. It's not a bit of data-driven storytelling in the ad. It's Maya Angelou reading out an incredibly powerful poem, and you're seeing football and karate and all sorts of different things. But actually, that's at the foundation of it. That's what underpins this amazing piece of successful public health education. Killer statistics, just give you a few of these. Just simple statistics. This is the campaign from CARE charity. 1 billion people go hungry every day. Children born into poverty, twice as likely to die before the age of 5. Just killer statistics. There's so much more that underpins this campaign. A child of malaria dies every 6 seconds. You can imagine that. 100% treatable. Killer statistics. As I say, I think where some people in the market research and the data analytics industry go wrong is having a fundamental lack of empathy as to who's going to be receiving the messages that they're given, be they clients or be they ultimately end consumers. I think that's true of advertising agencies and PR agencies as well. But if we can be empathetic and put ourselves in their shoes, then I think we stand a very strong chance of success. So relevant data, no false positives, signal from noise, curse of knowledge, leave it back in the lab, rational and emotional, workings out in reserve, and please do talk human, because we've got some amazing stories to tell, and we've heard some amazing stories. There's a statistic from Chip and Dan Heath in their book Made to Stick that after a presentation, 63% of attendees remember stories, and 5% of them remember statistics. So as you're putting together slide 161 for your client debrief, just remember the words of Chip and Dan Heath. And now, that's all. Apart from the fact we need a golden thread running through everything. Oh yes, one last thing. Friday the 13th, another great film. That's when April, narrative by numbers, comes out. Sorry, I tried to edit that out, but it's in there. If you're interested, talk to me or talk to the people at the front desk. But that really is all, folks.